Hello and welcome to Middlebury 5-0. I am your host, Officer Chris Mason, and with me in the studio today is Taborri Bruhl. Welcome to the show, Taborri.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
What a fabulous name, Taborri. I don't think I've ever met anybody called Taborri. Is there a story behind that? Where does
my
that
mom
come from?
heard my first name on the radio, and she made up the spelling, so
Right.
it's fairly unusual.
Yes.
The closest I found is actually Arabic. I guess one of the lead biographers of Muhammad about 1,000 years ago was named Taborri. So
Yeah, it has a Middle Eastern flavor to it, kind of romantic, sultry, I'd say. So I know a big concern of yours is sustainability.
It is.
I looked at a website, a web page, where you've written some things, and very impressive, very positive. It had a very positive flavor to it.
I am more optimistic than I was 5 years ago.
Right.
Yeah, which I suppose is good news.
I think so, yeah. Well, it's very refreshing, because I think a lot of times when people talk about sustainability, there's a lot of doom and gloom. There's a lot of apocalyptic vision.
Without a doubt. And we do have some serious problems.
For sure.
But I've also come to believe that we have the technology that we need to help solve a lot of these problems. So.
Sure. Yeah. And you touch upon some key areas on the website. It's kind of divided, it's classified into these different different arenas.
Yeah, so I suppose to back up, about probably 3 or 4 years ago, I've been interested in sustainability for a long time, but 3 or 4 years ago, it really struck me that humanity is on a kind of a bad path. We need to change, and and so we have 3 kids, and I suppose my thought was, when I'm old and I look back, what will my role have been? Yeah. So I decided then, it's like I'm going to do what I can to try to figure out where we're going, try to figure out how to do it. Yeah. So I started writing a blog, and I guess that's the main vehicle. I also have a Facebook page that's linked to the blog, and pretty much, I guess, if there's one thing I write about, it's how can I, as an ordinary person with a family and a job, live a life that's more sustainable. Right. How could we all make decisions in our life that are more sustainable?
Because the problems, I think, often just seem so epic,
they
so grand and daunting that it's demoralizing.
But
it's hard to know.
The flip side of that is there's a lot of edges to work on, because the problems are so big. There's a lot of ways we can tackle that.
Nibble away at the perimeter.
So we've made a lot of changes in our lives. When I think back 10 years ago when we moved to Vermont, we lived here in town in an old leaky farmhouse. It wasn't a farmhouse, but a house here in town that burned fuel oil, and I drove a pickup truck, and my wife drove a big Suburban. So compared to how we live now, it's a dramatic change. So today we live in a highly efficient house. We have solar panels on the roof of our barn. The solar panel, we drive 2 electric cars, and we make enough solar power to power both the cars and the house. Right. So we essentially don't have many bills, and we don't use much carbon in our day-to-day life, which, and if we can do it here in relatively cloudy Vermont, there's really no reason that just about everyone can't do it.
How did you come by the high efficiency house? Was that something you purchased, or was that something you constructed?
Yeah, well, we moved here and we had the house built, and that was certainly one of the things we wanted to achieve. And it was, for 10 years we were off-grid. The house is quite a ways back from the road, so 1/4 mile. So at the time it was going to be fairly expensive to bring the power back to the house. So I've always been interested in gadgets and such. So we put up solar and wind to power the house, and for about 10 years we were off-grid. And because we were putting in that kind of power system, I think that played a part too in how to design the house. So it has some passive solar aspects, and it's fairly high efficient. So efficient. So.
There's a lot of tension between my wife and I over these issues, because I favor the old romantic houses.
Oh yeah,
the ones that were built in the Victorian era or even older than that. And I like the character, the beams, and but my wife said no, we need a new, highly efficient energy efficient house.
It is possible to take an old house and do what they call a deep energy retrofit,
right,
and make it highly efficient. It is cheaper with new construction, though.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
a lot of the things we've done actually pay off, and the price of solar has dropped.
Right.
Solar can actually pay off. A lot of things people do in this vein have a payoff period of between 2 years and 10 or 11 or 12 years. So a lot of these things, if you have the money, you can think of it as an investment and it can pay off.
Sure.
But at what point it pays off to retrofit an older home, it's kind of a moving target as technology changes.
Right. Yeah.
But at some point it does become pretty difficult.
It seems like there's been such a shift. There's been such a rapid transformation just in the last few years.
I think back. So when we built the house 10 years ago and decided to go with solar, there was pretty much no solar in Vermont. I mean, I'm sure there were some somewhere but you never saw solar.
It was kind of a kooky fringe thing.
A kooky fringe thing. And look at the change now.
Right.
So, so I've actually said here lately that some of the things we see as daunting are actually going to be the easy changes. Switching to renewable power, I think, is going to be an easy change. Switching to electric cars is going to be an easy change. Not easy in the big scheme of things, but compared to some more difficult problems, I think. Right. So the difficult problems being, world population, disparity between rich countries and poor countries. Things like that are going to be a little bit harder to fix than learning how to drive an electric car in Vermont, or have solar panels on your roof. So
right. Yeah. Well, it seems like a lot of these sustainability issues are enmeshed in broader socioeconomic
They
issues.
are, and there's obviously not everyone agrees with. It's become, unfortunately, sustainability has become quite politicized. So suddenly it becomes a political statement, how you feel about the planet, which I think is really unfortunate. Regardless of your political beliefs, we all live on this planet, and common sense would tell you that we're kind of messing it up. So yeah, it's got a lot of baggage, so to speak.
Right. So
whether or not to put up industrial scale wind, or whether or not to put up these big solar farms. I always ask people when they talk about it, it's like what I call my magic wand test. If you had a magic wand and you could bling and fix everything, what would you change? So a lot of people like to complain about the solar and the wind, but if they had the magic wand, I don't know what they would do with it, because, short of inventing something new, to me it's imperative that we change. We've got to change. And I think we have the technology we need. We just need to, it's almost an attitude shift, a cultural shift in how we live our lives.
So I've got to throw that back at you. Like if you had the magic wand, Taborri, what would...
Yeah, well, that's one of those last blog posts I wrote was kind of about that.
Right.
I think in the future we're going to have a world that's powered almost completely by electricity. Electricity can be made renewably.
Sure.
I think we're going to shift completely away from fossil fuel, and I think we could do that now with the magic wand. We've got some building to do. So kind of interesting issues like this high voltage DC power line that's coming down through New Haven that has become quite controversial. That's one of those technologies that's going to help us move into this more sustainable future. High voltage DC lines can go thousands of miles without significant loss, much better than AC, and they can be put underground. So
that's a new way of moving
power,
energy
and we're going to
one
need
place
to
to
move
another.
energy. If I had the magic wand, we'd put a whole bunch of wind up in the Midwest and ship that power to the coast on things like high voltage lines.
Because that's been one of the issues is not so much generating the electricity, but storing it and moving it has become been kind of problematic.
Learning to live with intermittent renewable power is another change. That will be solved partly
that's
by
contrary to the American
partly
way
by
of
that
doing
is
things.
true. That is true. Yeah. So I think we have that is going to be both a technological fix and an attitude cultural fix.
You mean I can't watch my television whenever I want to watch television?
Well, more like you can't do anything you want with electricity anytime you want. But so in the 70s, they used to talk about nuclear power and how electricity would be too cheap to meter.
Right.
I think in the future, solar power is going to be too cheap to meter,
Mm-hmm.
but it's only going to be in the middle of the day. So I think
Mm-hmm.
we're going to see shifts in how we pay for electricity.
Mm.
So in the middle of the day, power's almost too cheap to meter, and that's when we charge our electric cars or heat or cool our houses or do major industrial things.
Yeah.
And then electricity might be more expensive at night when it's not as available.
Sure.
But I think when you see people that say we can't shift to renewable power, to me, that what they're saying is we can't shift to renewable power and use it like we do today, which might be true. But I see no reason we can't shift to renewable power and use power a little bit differently.
Yep.
And I think we have the technology to do it. We just need to put that technology into place and maybe live our lives a little bit differently.
Mm-hmm.
But it's possible, which is the good news, I think.
Right.
So,
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of these things, as you say, these are gathering pace. This is it's
very
not a
much
pie in the
so.
sky thing.
Yeah,
this
very much
is
so.
happening all around us.
And
Mm-hmm.
and probably just 3 or 4 years ago, I would talk about the shifts we need to make. It was like pushing on the side of a great big ship and trying to get it to move.
Right.
It's this huge mass that needs turned.
Mm-hmm.
But if I push and you push and everyone pushes, after a while that great big ship begins to move and it has
Right.
momentum in that direction.
Mm-hmm.
And as I look around in the last year, I was like, the ship's moving.
Right.
You know, I've been talking about this metaphor for, a couple of years, but suddenly you
Mhm.
see this great economy, the way people live is beginning to change.
Mhm.
People's attitudes are beginning to change. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. I feel like the will is there.
Yeah.
That there's been a massive shift. Like I
Right,
remember
yeah.
back in the 80s, talking to people about environmental crises and such. It
Yeah.
was, your reception would
Right,
generally be pretty
yeah.
frosty.
Yeah.
Now it seems like there's almost a
Yeah.
consensus, I would say.
And that's
that it,
another reason I write the blog. A lot of people, the will is there, and they're like, "What do I do?"
Mhm.
It's like, yeah, I want to be part of the problem, but how do is just composting my breadcrumbs, is that enough? Or my
Mhm.
coffee grounds?
sure.
So I do think there's pretty substantial things we can do as ordinary people.
So what are some things? What are some
To
little
me, the
pieces
biggest things we need to shift as people are how we make and use energy, and then how we grow our food.
Right.
Agricultural methods today are fairly destructive of the soil, and they're also a big part of global warming and CO2 emissions, how we grow our food,
Yeah.
related to the loss of carbon in soils, related to deforestation, the marginalization of soils around the world. So that's a difficult shift. And then getting away from fossil fuels is going to be a difficult shift.
Right.
But
Well, certainly fossil fuels are very much embedded in how we
yes,
farm,
and
the
they're
fertilizers that
and
we
that's
use,
and that's part of it as well. So those two shifts will come together.
the big heavy equipment
Yeah.
that we use and all the transportation.
So
shipping
yeah.
food
So when you
thousands
talk
of
about
miles.
farming changes,
Right.
so as an ordinary person, I think you can change where your electricity comes from. That's a
Right.
big one. If you can put up solar, if you can drive an electric car. So I drive an electric car and I power it with sunshine in my house. So that's
Mhm.
a huge change you can make. Reducing your consumption in general in terms of just frivolous consumption, buying 9 pairs of shoes or 20
Mhm.
dresses or whatever. Americans are big on consumption.
That is
yeah.
that
The
is a
farming, though, let
classical
me-
kind of
there are people out there in terms of how farming might change. It's not so much just powering the tractor with electricity. It's maybe farming in a way where we don't need tractors. So instead of plowing the soil, planting trees, perennial crops, agricultural systems that involve a variety of plants and animals that work in a way that each benefits each other. So tree crops, other perennial plants, rotational grazing. I think the farm of the future might not look like it does today. Might be quite a bit different. You're going to see lots more trees, lots more grass. This big open field that's been kept brown with spraying it with Roundup. That's a system that's extremely destructive. It happens to produce most of our food, so we can't scoff at it. But I do think we need to change it because it's so destructive. I don't think we can continue to farm like that.
Right.
So.
Well, sounds
It's just
beautiful.
a big challenge, yeah.
Yeah.
There are people that farm like that now and
Mhm.
do it profitably. But there's another mental shift. You know, where do our staple foods come from? You know, are we going to continue to eat annual grains? Are we going to make a shift and eat more things like chestnuts or oils from trees? And so it's possible, and some people are doing it, but relatively new. The good news is their farms, when they do this, become just like magnets for wildlife. So there's this huge amount of diversity of plants and animals on their farms while they're producing food. The food is more nutritious than just growing corn. You get all your vegetables and all your proteins and all your oils all from the same farm, as opposed to a big field of corn where you get one thing that's relatively nutritionally, you know, kind of a industrial feedstock more than a nutritious food. So that system's going to have to change, and that's going to be one of the big shifts. So yeah, stepping away from fossil fuel and changing how we farm, probably two of the big ones.
So is this something that you're largely exploring kind of by yourself? Like the blog post clearly is you, but are there organizations that you're working with?
And that's an interesting question. When I first started, I kind of felt like I was alone, and then as I read more and more and connected to more and more people, I realized I'm not alone at all. There's tens of thousands of people out there that are just as committed to sustainability, just as working hard to find solutions, trying to make changes in their lives. So yeah, unlike when I started, I don't feel alone anymore. And I think that I've often said here in Vermont, we're almost getting to what I call a critical mass, where we have enough people that governmental change will be a big part of this. But because democracy works, we're not going to get governmental change if only 10% of the people want it. But when we get at a certain point, we get enough people that want to go in a certain direction that we can make changes not only in our own lives personally, but then we can have government change. With it, carbon taxes or environmental protection policies or efficiency standards. And then we can really see that big ship start to move. And here in Vermont, there's a lot of people that think this way. And we are getting close to what I feel would be that point where we're going to see governmental action help us instead of having to do everything on our own as we try to live differently.
Well, I know that I interview a lot of people running for political office on the local level, and that is certainly one of the topics that pretty consistently comes up. So when I'm talking to politicians, when they're presenting their platform, that's always a component of it, and often it's a very critical central component of it too. So I'm seeing that shift within the political arena certainly.
So if we happen to be doing this show in other parts of the United States right now, you might not see that.
That's certainly a possibility, I don't know how much that is.
But so part of that
reflects the flavor of Vermont,
and
how much it's
that doesn't make it a bad thing. You know, I think we're pushing the boundaries here in Vermont sometimes, which is good, But it would so I often tell people the good and bad thing about democracy is that it works. And when most people don't want change, that's what politicians will respond to. You know, they want to keep their jobs, they want to get reelected. And so step one is for individuals to change. And then when there's enough individuals changing, then the government will follow.
So you mentioned a little earlier, kind of when we started talking about this, that it was really, it was having your kids that provided the momentum to kind of get you interested, engaged with these issues. Can you talk a bit more about that process? How this became kind of a central part of your identity?
Another thing that happened about the same time. So I teach history. So I teach high school at Rutland High School. So I teach history classes, and I was teaching about World War I and studying World War I, and I came across this.
Such a quagmire.
I came across this mid-20th century sculpture by, I think it was a German artist, and it's basically two figures kneeling, carved out of stone, but kneeling down. And this artist made these sculptures to beg the world for forgiveness for what their generation had done in World War I. I think this couple had lost their son in the war. And it just struck me as like, in the future, are we all going to be begging forgiveness from our grandchildren for what we did to the world? Or are we going to like see the writing on the wall and try to be a part of the solution? So it's like, down the road, I would like to personally be able to say, you know, I tried to make some changes. And I also think that none of us should underestimate how much one person can change things. So sometimes I don't know who I affect with the blog or, you know, giving talks, but I sometimes I do know, and I can say as a matter of fact that people have changed how they live because of me, you know, from time to time. So if I can convince one person to buy an electric car, you know, that's thousands of gallons of fossil fuel that doesn't get burned, or, you know, convince one family to put up solar, or put up solar and buy an electric car. You know, so suddenly we're thousands and thousands of gallons of fossil fuel a year that don't get burned. And the changes are sometimes just that simple, and we all just need to do it.
It seems really critical to kind of balance that, the ideology of it. Like, you need a little bit of
and that's,
idealism in order to motivate
but we need
yourself,
we need to live our lives too. You know, we can't all live in tents and eat dandelion greens. I don't think from an economic perspective that would help. But we need. But the good news is we like my family, we do live like normal people. You know, we're not, you know, sitting around with kerosene lamps, you know, and, you know, milking goats or something, you know. So we normal, ordinary people, but we're doing it in a way that's, I think, you know, dramatically lower carbon footprint than how a lot of people live.
So as a history teacher, as somebody who's studied some history, as a scholar of history, I would imagine to teach history, you have to delve
to some degree
into it. Is that an uplifting thing, or is it kind of demoralizing when you look back?
It can be both. You know, history. One thing I do get the sense of, though, as you look at the broad trajectory of history, is that we are right now in a really critical generation. World population has been growing by about 1 million people every 4 days since I've been alive. So when I was born in 1967, not all that long ago, there were 3.5 billion people on the planet, and today there's over 7. So every 4 days there's 1 million more people on the planet, and that growth is slowing, but not slowing, not fast enough. So as you look at the broad sweep of history, and you see economic development and population just skyrocket, it becomes clear that we've got to do something now. This is a generation, not now like this year, but now this generation. This is the generation that's going to kind of make or break humanity. On the bad side, if we don't change things, we could maybe not be able to live on the planet anymore. And a lot of other plants and animals not either. I think it's within our power as creative humans with intellects to do things in a different way and almost make it like a paradise on earth. You know, we have problems out there, but you know, we've solved a lot of problems before as humans. So so as I look at history, to me that's the lesson. It's like, wow, this is an amazing time that could go either way.
You think we're psychologically equipped to live in paradise?
Well,
or do we crave misery and opposition?
There might be some of that.
conflict?
I don't think we'll actually get there, so I don't think you have to worry too much. But I do think we can solve a lot of these problems.
You don't want me to lose too much sleep.
Don't lose too much sleep
worrying
over
about
having to live in
how
paradise.
we're gonna fare in paradise.
But I do think we can solve a lot of the problems, and particularly with regard to poor nations of the world. That's, like I said earlier, you know, switching to electric cars and solar power. That's the easy problem. You know, how do we deal with these poorest countries in the world with really high birth rates to help them live more like we do? So I have a good friend who always reminds me that caring about the environment is the luxury of a wealthy nation. So when you're just trying to feed your family, it doesn't matter as much, you know, where the planet's going in 10 years. You know, you're worried about today. And so until we can solve some of these poverty problems around the world, I think we're going to continue to struggle as a species to live on the planet.
So are there any particular historical epochs or historical figures that you draw inspiration from?
Oh, I don't know. Everyone always says Gandhi. And maybe that's a good example. I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Gandhi certainly, tried to live the life that he wanted to see.
Right.
So I think it was Gandhi that said, "Live the change you want to see in the world." And
That sound familiar.
There probably can't be a better little anecdote, I think, for us to live our lives by.
Right.
And then, kind of a separate thing, but I don't think, a lot of people seem to think that somewhere out there is some evil destroyer that's messing everything up. Big corporations, faulty governments, and I don't think that's true. It's just 7 billion people like us trying to live our lives. And the problems come just from this mass of people all trying to live their lives. Right. The flip side of that is that if there is no evil destroyer, if it's just people like us, then who's going to fix it? It's people like us. It's people like us that are going to fix it. Yeah. So ordinary people making changes, learning about these things. Yeah. So
I agree that that whole kind of evil genius model
I don't think there's
where bad things originate.
I'm sure there's some evil geniuses out there, but not as many. So, not as many as people think.
Yeah, more a product of television, I think.
So most of our problems are just, particularly in poor nations, just a function of people trying to live their lives and to get by. So.
Well, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Anytime.
It's been such a pleasure, and it's been really uplifting.
Yeah,
getting to
I hope so.
Hear about your positive vision and your hope for the future.
Yeah, no, I without a doubt think that we can do this thing. It's a big problem, but we can do it.
It's heartening.
So
until next time, drive safe, and may all your mischief be of the lawful persuasion.